Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 horrifying facts about Aztec warriors. Number 10. They preferred to capture, not kill.
Unlike many other ancient warriors, Aztecs didn't want to kill their enemies on the battlefield. Instead, they wanted to capture them. Killing an enemy was actually considered to be clumsy, and the Aztecs believed it took much more skill to capture an enemy alive and bring them back to the famed Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. Since it was such a skilled task, it became a way to measure a man's ability as a warrior. It was how he moved up the ranks. For example, for an Aztec to become a jaguar or eagle, he needed to capture 4 enemies. So why would they capture their enemies instead of killing them? Well, that was for...
Number 9. They practiced human sacrifice with their captives.
The Aztecs had strong religious beliefs. They had hundreds, if not thousands, of gods, and the gods were responsible for everything. They were the reason the sun rose and the reason the rain fell from the sky. Aztecs also thought that the gods needed to be nourished with blood. One way they fed the gods was through bloodletting, which involved an individual cutting themselves. People higher up in society were expected to give the most blood. Another way that Aztecs fed their gods was by killing enemy warriors. This is why capturing enemies alive was so important. They were needed for sacrifices to the gods. The practice of hunting and capturing enemy soldiers was called the terribly misleading War of the Flowers or the Flowery Wars. It was a decree of constant war because sacrifices were always needed. The War of the Flowers was waged on other city-states of Mesoamerica, but the Aztecs focused heavily on raiding the nearby city of Tlaxcala. As for the rituals, most sacrifices were the same. One thing that did vary was how many people were sacrificed in one ceremony. It could range from 1 to thousands. The sacrifices were taken to the top of a pyramid and placed face up on an altar. The priest would make an incision under the ribs and then stick his hand in the wound, reach into the chest cavity, find the heart and yank it out while it was still beating. The victim would have likely felt all of this, by the way. Once the heart was out, it was thrown into a fire. The body was pushed down the steps of the pyramid. If the person sacrificed was noble or held some importance, they were often carried down.
Number 8. The dreaded Maquawati.
The most devastating weapon used by the Aztec warriors was the Maquawati, which means hungry wood. While the Aztecs were advanced in many ways, one technology they didn't develop was forging, so they had no metal weapons. Instead, the Maquawati was a flat wooden paddle with razor-sharp volcanic stones called obsidian embedded in its side. Apparently, the weapon was powerful enough to decapitate a human. According to a report from invading Spaniards, an Aztec warrior even used a Maquawati to decapitate a horse in one blow. The story about the horse decapitation was tested on the television show The Deadliest Warrior. With a few whacks, the stand-in for the Aztec warrior was able to cut through a horse's neck made of ballistic gel.
Number 7. Their version of the afterlife was, well, different.
The afterlife of most religions usually rewards people for how they've lived. It was a bit different in the Aztec religion because how someone died was the deciding factor on which afterlife they went to. There were 4 different afterlives. The warrior's afterlife showed exactly how much the Aztecs loved war because if someone died in battle or they were sacrificed, their souls would go to an afterlife which involved even more war. In that afterlife, which was in the west, they would help a god fight against the darkness to ensure the sun would rise. They stayed in this afterlife for 4 years before returning to Earth as a hummingbird or some other exotic bird. As for the other afterlives, the one in the east was for women who died during childbirth. They were treated similar to fallen soldiers and sacrifices, and they helped prepare the sun for its journey into the underworld. In the south, it was an afterlife for people who died because they were struck by lightning, drowned, or died from leprosy or another sickness. In that afterlife, there was plenty of food. Finally, there was the afterlife called Mictlan, which was for people who died ordinary deaths like from old age. In that afterlife, souls had 4 years to pass through 8 levels of challenges, which included climbing an obsidian mountain and passing through an area full of beasts that eat human hearts. The 9th level was where their souls would finally find rest.
Number 6. Every male was trained for war.
The Aztecs had no official standing army. Instead, every male in the culture was trained for battle. But their training would start rather late compared to many other warrior cultures. Aztec boys would live with their families through adolescence, where they would provide manual labor around the home. They would learn essential skills that would help them become good soldiers, like hunting. However, boys of noble birth probably started their training much earlier in life, sometimes as early as 6 years old. When the boys reached the age of 13, they were sent for their training in the capital, on a training ground called the Calmacac. There they were taught to read and write. They were taught the calendar and studied astronomy among many other academic topics. They also learned practical skills that revolved around daily chores. When they were 15, the boys moved on to warrior training, where the veteran warriors taught the boys how to fight and instilled courage in the young men.
Number 5. Levels of Aztec warriors.
The Aztec army had 3 different levels, and the first consisted of the Jaguars and Eagles. There wasn't much difference between the two besides the outfits that they wore. The 2 ranks weren't always separate either. For example, there were records of high-ranking warriors being called Eagle-Jaguar warriors. Above the Jaguar and Eagle warriors were soldiers who were able to capture 5 or 6 enemies, and people who reached that rank were called Otomies. At this level, warriors would be given their own shield and Maquawity. Above that was the most elite fighting force in the Aztec army, the Shorn Ones. They gained that name because they shaved their head but kept a long braid of hair on the left side of their head and wore a yellow uniform. To become a Shorn One, the warrior had to capture at least 20 men. The Shorn Ones also had to take a vow which said they were not allowed to step backwards during battles.
Number 4. They employed psychological warfare.
While Aztec Jaguars and Eagles had similar roles in the Aztec army, they dressed completely differently. As you can probably guess, they dressed like their namesakes. Eagles were adorned with feathers, and they wore wooden helmets that made it look like the warrior's face was coming out of the mouth of an eagle. The Jaguars, on the other hand, wore the skin of a jaguar, and the helmet looked like a jaguar. It is believed that the point of these uniforms was for psychological warfare. Surprise attacks from fast-moving and agile animal men were supposed to frighten their enemies. Besides their outfits, they also banged drums and made a lot of noise, adding even more pandemonium to the attack. This would cause their enemies to panic and possibly scatter, which would have made them easier to capture.
Number 3. The god of fire and wisdom, Huateot.
Human sacrifices were important to the Aztecs, and most of the time the victims were sacrificed in the manner mentioned in Entry 6. However, that wasn't the only sacrificial ceremony they did. One of the more notable sacrifices was to that of Huateot, the god of fire and wisdom. There were 2 different ways the ceremony was done, and they were both horrifying. According to Time magazine, the first way is that victims would be thrown into a pit of hot coals while priests in black danced. Before the victim died, they were pulled up by hooks and placed on the altar. Then their blistered chest was cut open and the heart was removed. In a variation on the ceremony, which happened every 52 years, after the heart was removed, the priest would try and start a fire in the chest. If the fire was successful, then the empire would stay alight for the next 52 years. However, if the fire didn't start, that would be a sign that a monster was coming, and he would use darkness to hunt and eat all of mankind.
Number 2. Xipe-Totec and still more brutal rituals.
The most disturbing ritual that Aztec warriors collected sacrifices for was the tribute to Xipe-Totec, or our Lord the Flayed One. That was the god of spring and agriculture who helped the transition of boys into men. Xipe-Totec was celebrated every spring in March, and there were 3 gruesome rituals that were performed in his honor. The first ritual involved the heart being removed as usual, but then the victim's skin was flayed. The skin was dyed yellow and the priests wore the skin, which they called golden clothes, for 20 days. Shedding the skin was symbolic of the earth changing from winter to spring. The second way a victim was sacrificed was that they were tied to a frame and shot with arrows, slowly bleeding to death while attendees sang hymns. The third, and perhaps oddest way to die during the rituals to Xipe-Totec was called gladiatorial sacrifice. Outside of the temple dedicated to Xipe-Totec, a captured warrior would be tied to a big stone and he would be forced to drink Oxley. This was an alcoholic drink. They were given primitive weapons and barely any protection. The warrior then had to fend off 4 fully dressed and heavily armed Aztec warriors, 2 Jaguars and 2 Eagles. If the Aztecs wounded the sacrifice, he was taken to the altar where he had his heart pulled out and he was possibly flayed. However, if the sacrifice fended off the 2 Eagles and 2 Jaguars, a left-handed warrior would be added to the mix. The fight would go on until the warrior was injured, and then he'd be sacrificed.
Number 1. The downfall of the Aztecs.
All the way back in Entry 9, we mentioned that many of the sacrifices came from the neighboring city of Tlaxcala. What's interesting is that the Aztecs were an incredibly powerful civilization and could have easily taken over Tlaxcala, but they didn't. Instead, they more or less used the city as a farm for human sacrifices. For reasons that should be obvious, the people of Tlaxcala didn't like being treated this way, and this ultimately proved to be the Aztecs' downfall. When Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortes and 400 soldiers marched into Mexico, they were led to the Aztec capital, where Cortes was supposedly welcomed because he had light skin like the god Quetzalcoatl, who had been prophesied to return to Earth. This allowed Cortes to get close to the Aztec leader, Montezuma II, and his inner circle. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Spaniards' weapons were much better than the Aztecs, and they quickly took the upper echelon of the Aztec civilization hostage. The noblemen were executed during this time, and somehow Montezuma died as well. Eventually, the Aztecs were able to chase the Spaniards out of the capital, but they wouldn't stay away long. The Spaniards teamed up with the Tlaxcalans, and by August 13, 1521, the Aztecs were defeated. It's believed that almost 250,000 Aztecs were killed during the conquest. After slaughtering the people, Cortez had the city razed and built Mexico City in its place.
So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, over there on the right are a couple of other historical lists that you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one, and thank you for watching.